Um, but, we'll fast forward to a few years ago, and you're a relatively faithful, leading church member, and you find yourself with the tribe you grew up with on trial for heresy.
I found myself in a situation where the context was there was an ever narrowing within our tradition. And there was almost a who's the next liberal. And so that kind of narrowing, which some people had warned me about years before, and I didn't believe it. I thought, no, it's just standing up for basic convictions, biblical conviction. But that was true. And so there was always a narrowing to the point that I would think, how am I here? I'm a very conservative, evangelical, homeschooling dad of 5. How are we having these conversations? And so, it was kind of like, it's kind of like what's going on in a lot of institutions in American life, and not just religious institutions. You have the institutions in crisis and declining, and that leads to a situation where, for lack of a better word, the normies, the grown-ups who normally would have run things, pull back, and you have some people who have very quarrelsome, destructive sorts of patterns who are left unchallenged because everybody else doesn't really understand that psychology. And so they assume, well, if you just kind of ignore this and maybe give more and more, just do what they want you to do, that will bring about some kind of unity. And it doesn't work.
So you're saying in the particular cultural moment we're in, people who would be more moderate, people who would be representative of perhaps the majority of people, tend to step back in a season like this. Can you explore that a little bit? Like, why does that happen?
What happens is you can have a very small group of people who can absolutely control the temperature of an organization, because they're willing to do almost anything. Or at least they're willing to do things that normal people would not be willing to do. And so you have the majority, often the vast majority of people who, because they're not given, for all kinds of good reasons, they're not given to fighting and craziness and all these things, they start to just step back and to disengage. And their whole, one of the things in our denomination, it took a lot of work to convince the healthiest people to be involved. You had to tell them, this is why you need to be here. And because they didn't need to have some sort of a honorific title of having served on some board or some committee. They had lives and ministries that they were carrying out, which left often the people who really wanted to be there and who really wanted to be at a microphone at a meeting. And that's not that's just not a balanced way of going forward. And so a lot of times what happens for instance, take a local congregation. You've got a small group of people who maybe they're coming up against the pastor. And what they do is to start just one thing after the other coming in, and there's all kinds of the same tactics that are involved. Well, even if 90% of the people are perfectly happy with the pastor, what eventually starts to happen is those 90% start saying, wow, we're really exhausted by this. Why is the pastor always in controversy? And so what they're going to do is to eventually come to him, usually, and say, why don't you just kind of apologize or make this go away? because the pastor can't really respond, because if he does, that small group of people will say, "Oh, look at the pastor being divisive." So you
Wow.
can't do that. And so it's a very, very difficult place to be. And you eventually end up then with those good people just getting worn down, and they get exhausted.